Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. It's November 16th, 2022, and I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. We often feature bioacoustic recordings and experts who explain how they help inform science and conservation here on this podcast, but there's also value in simply appreciating the sheer wonder of the natural world and its sounds. Sounds that are, it should be said, disappearing from the natural world as bird and insect populations decline due to the biodiversity crisis. So today we speak with George Vlad, who has spent the past several years traveling the world, listening to and recording nature in all its glory. Vlad says he's especially interested in wildlife and conservation issues, so he usually seeks out places where nature is still unspoiled by human activities. He's here to share some of his recordings with us today. But first, he tells us a bit about how he got into recording pristine natural soundscapes in the first place.
My career path has been winding and not very clear for a long time. I started out by doing editing for podcasts and audiobooks, but this was just a way for me to put my skills to use because I had been passionate about composing music and doing sound design. I had been passionate about sound, going back all the way to my early childhood. I was fascinated with objects that made sound, all that kind of stuff. And then, I started off editing audiobooks, podcasts. I was asked to do a few sound effects here and there, some music. Then I realized there was a bit more excitement to be found working in video games. And slowly I started to switch to video games completely. Just wanted to work on that. Went to university, studied sound design. Burnt out, as you usually do, because I was working and studying at the same time. And that was, to me, kind of a revelation, because I realized I was spending sometimes even 100 hours a week in the studio working on video games and media. And I thought that was my passion. I thought that was what I wanted to do in life. But obviously, that takes a toll. And after many months of doing that, I burnt out. I couldn't work anymore. I wasn't productive anymore. And then I had to take a break. I took a month off. This is at the time when I was studying in Scotland. I flew back to Romania. I spent the entire month of December driving around, going to the mountains, walking, hiking, taking photos, and crucially, recording sound, focusing on very subtle sounds like very soft snow falling in the forest, the clicks and all the movement that happens when there's no wind and there's a lot of humidity in the air and everything freezes overnight, so you get all this beautiful ambience that you can't really explain what it is if you hear it out of context. But basically that month was for me a point where I decided to make that, at least to introduce that into my work, because it was clearly not healthy for me to be in the studio for endless hours. So ever since, I've been going on short trips. I lived in Scotland, so I used to go into the Highlands and into the national parks, listening, taking photos, recording, coming back to the studio, learning from my mistakes, and doing it all over again. And then I started to expand my circle. I went to Scandinavia, went back to Romania a bit, and then I realized what I wanted to do was to explore further afield. So I flew to Africa for a few workshops, and then I started to organize my own expeditions. And I got asked by people that I was working with for sound recordings from these places, which, it was, looking back, it looks all very organic and like a logical progression. But back then I had no idea what I was doing. I was just going somewhere, looking at the map, thinking, oh, this might be interesting. I'm just going to go there. So I ended up in Senegal. I went to Ethiopia, to Gabon. I went to a bunch of places just because I was very curious what they sounded like. And I couldn't find many examples online. It was a learning curve, of course. There were many places where I went, and instead of finding, beautifully pristine soundscapes, I realized there was a lot of man-made sound, which is kind of my nemesis. It takes a special skill to work out how to get rid of that and how to record pristine soundscapes. But overall, that's how I got into sound recording. And at the moment, I do about 40 to 50% sound recording, and then the rest is work in the studio, working on video games, on films, editing my recordings, putting them out, sharing them with people. And occasionally I do some conservation work as well. I train scientists to go out and get good sound recordings. I share my recordings with whoever needs them, and it's kind of a good balance between studio and field work.
So, do scientists or conservationists ever use your recordings as baseline data to inform their research on ecosystems?
They do, yeah, and I'm happy to share, but it's not my main job. It's very rare that I get asked for recordings. I think scientists like to do it themselves because you have to be very diligent and very specific about how you actually record these sounds. So I recently worked with a PhD candidate who went to Borneo, and I taught him how to use a specific recorder. I gave him advice, suggestions. And then when he got back, we had a chat and he explained to me what he did, which is he made 15-minute recordings at the same height from the ground, same settings on the recorder. And he had to do it in a sort of a grid pattern, which makes total sense when you think about it. It's sort of when you think about a transect, if you go out and listen to things and look at things and count things and write them down, the recording just adds to that. It's just another way of gathering data. That's not the thing that I do. When I go into the field to record, I listen for specific things that I'm focusing on. For example, if I want to record lions in the Serengeti, I'm going there and I'm looking out specifically for that. I might set up some microphone rigs for 1 or 2 days or even a week at a time where I expect these species, the lions, for example, to call. Or I would go somewhere and record something for its aesthetic value. I share recordings on my YouTube channel, and that's purely for enjoyment, purely for people to listen to, and hopefully to start appreciating soundscapes and nature more and wildlife. But there's a tiny overlap there between the work I do and the work that scientists do. Sometimes I may get recordings of a rare species that they might want to listen to. I can give them all the details they need, like location, pinpoint everything on a map, time of day, time of the year, everything else. But generally, in my experience, scientists want to have as much control as possible and want to make the recordings themselves.
You mentioned your YouTube channel, which has dozens of sound recordings up, and people can find that at youtube.com/George Vlad. So is that the focus of your recording work, making these sound recordings almost as a means of public engagement with nature?
Not necessarily. When I started out, I was focused on getting sounds I could use in my work. So I was getting dawn choruses and individual species because I used that as a sound designer in films and video games. And that's still what pays the bills at the moment. If I'm going to Ethiopia in a few weeks and I want to record a few species there. I want to gather some clean bird song from that area. Maybe I can use it in films and video games. So I did that for a long time. And then I went to this workshop in South Africa where I was in a group. And there was me and another person who worked on films, and we had this very similar approach. And then everyone else was a sound artist and a composer and had a very different approach where they recorded sound for purely aesthetic value. They would walk, they would record themselves, they would capture things that I thought they just contradicted my expectations of a clean recording. But then after talking to them, after, listening to their work and getting to know them better, I realized that sound isn't just a product. Sound isn't just a resource to go somewhere and gather and then come back. Sound can be used to way more effect just by playing it for people, or by, you can use sounds to raise awareness about things. So that kind of changed my perspective a bit. And I realized that I had I have thousands of hours of recordings, many terabytes that no one ever listens to. And that's a pity, isn't it? I record so that people listen to my recordings. I don't record just for myself. I don't want to hide these recordings. And in many cases, I go to places where people with recorders and proper microphones have never been there. So it would be selfish of me to just keep them for myself. So when that happened, this was about 2018, 2017, I realized that I was missing out on this aspect of sharing my recordings and talking about them. And of course, with that comes stories and, all this. People have some kind of image of Africa, for example, where they think everything's wild. There's just animals everywhere. There's no people. So with my recordings, I try to correct these skewed perspectives and also to bring attention to environmental issues. And this developed into a side project for myself where I have more than 100 videos in a playlist on YouTube where it's just soundscapes. Most of them are natural soundscapes. Some of them are people in remote villages or in places like that. Rarely there's people in cities, but they all tell a story, and that's to me is very important, and it's getting a lot of attention recently. I've started to use it as a platform to raise awareness. I've used my recordings to raise money for initiatives that I've worked with on the ground. It's developing into its own thing, and I like it. I don't think I will ever do it 100%, but I think if I only focused on recording sound for its use, for its purpose in sound design or sound editing, I think I'd be missing out.
So, how much of your recording is focused on finding places where there is no human influence or sounds versus exploring the human-nature interface?
Initially, I was clearly trying to avoid any kind of man-made sound. I remember being in Senegal, and we were trying to get away as far as possible. We got lost in the eastern part of the country. We almost ran out of fuel. But for me, that was exhilarating because I thought I was in a very remote place. I was not expecting to see people. And we camped out one evening. We had no idea where we were. I thought I was hearing lions and hyenas in the distance. And then in the morning we woke up and we were in a village's back, we were in the backyard of a village. But it was not your ideal image of a village where there's buildings next to each other and things like that, like in Eastern Europe, for example. It was a very dispersed kind of way of living. So there was a hut here and there were wildlife, there were livestock. And I thought I'd failed in my quest to get away from man-made sound. But then again, I started to appreciate the sound of humans living in nature, because there was no like distant industry or traffic. There were just people. You'd have a small group of people under a tree telling stories or having breakfast or things like that, and that sounded natural to me. It was stretching my definition of natural sound to include humans, which obviously, looking back, it makes total sense. Humans have for a long time lived in close connection with nature, and you can't look at nature and take humans out and think, okay, we're not part of nature or anything like that. So while initially I was indeed trying to get away from that, at the moment I like to record soundscapes in villages or in places where there are humans as well. Sometimes, without trying to do that, I record people singing, for example. I was in Madagascar a few months ago, and I got this beautiful recording of a lady rowing down a river and singing. And it was beautiful. You had these walls, because the river was in a canyon. It was the Manambulu River. But I got this recording, and I was not trying to get that. I was trying to get the sound of nature and wildlife there. But I was so happy, and it's still one of the most beautiful recordings I ever made. And it has the human element in it, which I'm starting to appreciate more and more in my work. I think we can raise awareness about people living at the forefront of conservation, living, in closer communion to nature, and sometimes getting into conflict with wildlife.
Well, we do, of course, have a bunch of your recordings to listen to today. There are two sets of clips here. One set is from the Javari Valley in the Amazon. The other is from rainforests in the Congo Basin. So let's start with the Javari Valley recordings. Can you set the stage for us a little by telling us about the location itself? I know this is the forest where, tragically, British journalist Dom Phillips and indigenous activist Bruno Pereira were murdered last summer.
So obviously, the Javari Valley has a bit of a tragic significance after the events that happened there a few months ago. And, it's not the main reason I went there. I was planning to go on this trip in 2020, just before the pandemic started. And obviously, I didn't go there because everything, borders got shut, everything got canceled. And I kept wanting to go back. So I never canceled the trip. I just postponed it. And this year I decided, okay, it's time. I think it's safe enough to go. And I went there. I spent 10 days in a place called Palmari, which is kind of a part research station, part lodge, I would say. Well, it's not very fancy. It's not very upmarket, but it's a place where you have a lot of researchers go into the rainforest to do research. There's tourists as well. They work with locals. There's local guides. There's local staff. It's a pretty cool place to be. I went there to do sound recording mostly and to see what the kind of way of life is for the locals there. I didn't get to explore that too much. I just visited one village and we met a few of the fishermen from the village. What struck me is how underdeveloped the area is. There are many little villages on the side of the river, both in, actually, this is a triple border between Colombia, Peru, and Brazil. So on any side of the river, there will be people living in small communities. There is nothing for them to do there apart from, if they want to feed themselves, they have to go hunt or fish. There's no work for them. If they have to send their kids to school, they have to get on a boat to go to the nearest town, which is, maybe 10 miles or 15 miles or 20 miles away. There's no industry. There's no facilities. If they have to go to a clinic or something, they have to spend 4, 5, 6 hours in a boat getting to the nearest town. It's a pretty bleak picture. But at the same time, it's when you look at it, it's people there. They don't seem like they're missing out on much. They're pretty happy with what they have. Conservation is not on anyone's minds, obviously, because their priorities are very different. But having said that, it doesn't seem like it's a very bad place for wildlife. There has been deforestation. In some places you can clearly see it. There's machinery and implements on the side of the river for loading logs onto boats and things. There's not that many big trees. It's not you can't call it a virgin or a primary rainforest. But at the same time, it's not degraded, to the level that I've seen in other parts of the Amazon, in Peru or in Brazil. So it's a mixed bag, with regards to how well preserved it is. But there's a lot of wildlife. I could walk for many hours, inland, far from the river, and then that was the only way to get away from the main river and from the sound of boats on the river. Yeah, I was not expecting it to be pristine. It was okay. It was good. I got some very good sound recordings. I saw some nice wildlife. I'm sure if I spent more time there, I would have seen even more and managed to explore more. And I might go back there soon.
So the first Javari Valley recording we have here is called Calm Afternoon in Thick Secondary Rainforest. What can you tell our listeners about what they'll hear in this recording?
This is a recording I made in a little riverbed, which had no water at this time of the year because it was a so-called dry season. It was a very, very hot and humid afternoon. I just set up my recording rig over there and walked away from it and left it record for a day or two. But this was just after I had left it there. You don't really hear much. It's kind of a very lazy afternoon. You hear a bunch of insects. Insects are prevalent this time of the day. There's a different dove. I'm not sure exactly what species of dove or paloma, as it's called in those parts. I don't know the species name. And there's not much happening, but it's very good for painting this picture of hot afternoons. If you were, I was trying to hike with maybe 15 kilos of equipment, and I had to stop very often because I was sweating a lot. Obviously, it's so hot that your sweat doesn't really cool you. So I was overheating and I was exhausted. But that, listening to that soundscape, it feels a bit oppressive, but also beautiful at the same time. It's a weird feeling that I get in many rainforests.
All right, here's Calm Afternoon in Thick Secondary Rainforest. All right, and tell us about Evening on Small Tributary.
Oh, this was one of my favorite parts there. This is, it's not even a tributary, actually. It used to be a tributary, but then it got cut off from the Javari River. So they call it a lagoon. It's a very long stretch of water that ends maybe a mile before it reaches the main river. And I don't think it's connected. It's not flowing, but it's a bit of a weird body of water, and there's a lot of wildlife around it. There's a lot of fishermen as well there. Every time we went there, we would see people fishing. They had a big boat on the main river with a huge icebox the size of a big fridge, and they basically spent 3 or 4 days over there fishing, and they would load that with fish and then go to the market or go sell it to others. It was a beautifully sounding place because it was pretty narrow, so you'd get these reflections from the edge. It was forested everywhere, so you'd get this beautiful echo every time you had a slightly louder sound. And this recording is made unattended as well. I set up my microphones on the edge of the river and left them there, very inconspicuous. So after we left, there was a couple of fishermen, and they were fishing and talking, and I got some of that. I think they're quite far away from the rig, so you can just hear some water splashing. There's also fish moving in the water. There's birds fishing. There's some wing beats from a couple of turkey vultures who were close to the microphone. It's a very quiet moment in when you compare it with dawn or dusk choruses. It's just before the dusk chorus starts when you hear the insects become louder, and you start hearing owls and pauraques and other species that you can hear at night. But again, for me, it's a way to capture one very fleeting moment when day starts to change into evening, and yeah, it's beautiful and immersive, and you can pinpoint things if you listen with headphones or with a good playback system. You can actually hear where sounds are coming from, and the beautiful reflections. That's amazing. I just love that.
This next one sounds particularly cool. This is Thunderstorm Approaching.
While I was there, I told you I was there in the so-called dry season, but the dry season isn't dry. It's just the dry season is wet, and the wet season is much wetter. We had a few thunderstorms. We had very heavy rain. They used to come in the afternoon. We'd see them on the horizon from a vantage point. So I'd see a lot of lightning and hear a lot of thunder. And I got some nice photos of that, some nice video. But it sounded to me like they were either too far away, or they would come very close so fast that I wouldn't really capture the sound of the thunderstorm approaching. So one afternoon I could see this thunderstorm kind of circling around us. It was moving from place to place, but it was not getting close. Luckily I had 4 or 5 recording rigs out, so a few of them captured it very beautifully. And this is one of them. This is probably the best recording I have of that thunderstorm. It was spectacular. I was out on the porch getting eaten alive by mosquitoes, but I couldn't get myself to go back to bed, because I wanted to see what was happening. I wanted to see the lightning and hear the thunderclaps. And then, yeah, it was pretty amazing. I've experienced thunder and thunderstorms in other parts of the world, but these were just probably the most violent, but also the most beautiful. There's this feeling you get from being exposed. It wasn't really exposed because I was in a little hut. But at the same time, I feel like I wasn't 100% sheltered, because if there was a big enough storm, it could have destroyed my little hut. If there was a thunder strike nearby, that could have set things on fire. So I was kind of feeling this exposure, but that made me more alert and more aware of where I was. I was very immersed in what was happening, which for me made it even more beautiful and exciting.
Next is a recording called Calm Rain in Secondary Rainforest. I don't suppose this is the same storm you captured approaching.
No, this was I think it was recording at night. It was recorded in the same place we played the recording of the calm afternoon with the same rig, but I think this was 2 nights later when there was no thunder, or there was very distant thunder, and the rain was not very violent. It was just calm and I would say relaxing. I often woke up at night and walked out and had a quick listen to what was happening, just to check, if there's new species in the surroundings, if there's things happening that I could record. And one of my favorite things was to go out when it was raining, to just feel some of that coolness after a very hot day, and to listen to it, because it's amazing. Rain can sound like a million things, and there's so many factors, so many variables, like the thickness of the leaves surrounding the microphones, how the canopy is. If the canopy is very thick, it's only going to let the rain fall through after half an hour or even an hour of raining, and then you get all these big drops. If the rain penetrates through the canopy fast, you get these little drops. So there's so many ways you can talk about rain, and this is one of the rain recordings that I made there. That's more relaxing rather than worrying or stressful or anxiety inducing.
And the final recording we've got here from the Javari Valley is called Evening on Small Tributary with Water Movement.
We can hear toucans. The little wah, wah, wah sound, that's the toucans calling. They don't really call that much this time of the year in this part of the Amazon. When I was in Peru a few years ago, I could hear them call at different times of day, and they would call for longer periods. In this part of the Amazon, I could only hear them call in the afternoon, maybe for 10 minutes or 20 minutes, and then they would stop, and then, you'd hear the owls and everything. But I like this. As I said, this is when you get the golden hour, the nice colors, because the sun is setting, and you get this feeling that things are changing. It's going to, night is going to fall soon. And this was paired with a bird of prey calling from a tree nearby, which I haven't identified yet. I'm not sure. It's probably a hawk or some kind of eagle. But you can hear it. It's a very heavy contrast because it sounds urgent. It sounds, the sound penetrates through other frequencies. It's a bit unsettling to hear that so close as well. But at the same time, it gives you an impression of what it feels like to be there. If you're one of the prey of this bird of prey, if you're a smaller bird or a little mammal or a monkey even, this sound is alarm. You have to hide or you have to go away. It's a very interesting way to experience the rainforest, thinking about, what you hear, how that affects what animals are around you. I quite like this recording because of this contrast between the calmer sounds and then the sound of the bird of prey.
So now we've got 5 recordings from a Congo Basin rainforest. Can you tell us where exactly these recordings were made and how they contrast with the recordings from the Amazon that we just listened to?
These recordings, I captured them on a trip to Gabon in 2018. I flew into the country and then we drove for about 2 days, and then we had to take a train at midnight, and then we had to drive for another day, And then we had to walk through the rainforest for another day because there was no roads basically there. So some of these recordings are made in Ivindo National Park. Some of them are in Lope National Park. And I think one of them is just made off the side of a road. We stopped because it was nightfall. We stopped in a village, and from there we just drove on a track for as far as we could, and then we walked for a bit. It was the border between Gabon and the Republic of the Congo. And anywhere in that part of the country, I was able to record for 48 hours at a time without capturing any man-made sound, which was unheard of for me. As I told you, this man-made sound, specifically distant engines and aircraft, these are my nemesis. I go to great lengths to get away from them, and it's very frustrating when I can't. I was in Borneo, for example, where you have these huge plantations and they have to be patrolled by people on scooters and mopeds, and there's never a moment where you can say, okay, let's have 2 hours of just nature sound. No, because you'll get these people patrolling, then they might have a generator somewhere for electricity. And I can understand it. I'm not saying that it's the wrong thing to do. I don't know about plantations. As far as I know, they're damaging to the ecosystems, and they support maybe 5 or 10 species as opposed to hundreds of species that primary rainforest supports. But that's a different story. Going back to Gabon, these recordings I did not have to work for them beyond getting there. I just went somewhere, set up a microphone rig, press record. That was it. I got these beautiful recordings. And yeah, the one I made in Dubai, which we'll play later, that was for me an amazing experience to see so much wildlife and this huge opening in the rainforest with no people around it. You'd expect that to be swarming with tourists and to be such like a huge thing for people to want to witness, but it's so remote and so difficult to reach that there's almost no one there. It's only been very recently discovered, so to speak, by Westerners, because why would you go there? There's just rainforest there. There's not much else. But yeah, being in Gabon, being in that part of the Congo Basin rainforest was eye-opening for me. Quite difficult as well. It was my most ambitious trip to date. But I'm very happy I managed to get these recordings because there's nothing like it around. I've tried to find anything, but there isn't.
Well, longtime listeners to the Manga Bay Newscast might already be familiar with bais. These are natural clearings in the rainforest, of course. And we did an episode back in May 2020 that featured recordings of elephants at a bai called Dzonga Bai in the Central African Republic. The first recording we have here from the Congo Basin is actually the one you made at a bai, and it's another thunderstorm approaching. What else can you tell our listeners about it before we take a listen?
So that is recorded in the Languye Bai, which is a big clearing in the rainforest in Ivindo National Park. And there's an observation post there that's a bit derelict. It's almost falling apart now. And you can spend the night there, apparently. I had to choose between spending the night there and leaving my equipment there to spend the night for me, which I chose in the end. I prefer to have these good recordings instead of me being there. And this, as I said, this is a huge clearing in the rainforest, the size of many football pitches. And in the middle, there are mud pools where elephants and gorillas and other animals, they come to look for minerals, and they frolic and they bathe in the mud, they have a lot of fun. And they make sounds as well. So we witnessed this moment when there was a small family of elephants. There were mothers and babies. And then all of a sudden, this big male comes, and he was obviously, he felt like he felt like all the other elephants had to make way for him. So he was, brash, and he was making a lot of splash, a lot of noise, calling here and there. And obviously the others moved. But these interactions, you'd get the immediate sound, where they were calling and splashing around. But then you get these reflections from the edge of the clearing, which were amazing. And you can hear some in this recording because you also, you get the thunderstorm and you get the sense of how big the space is. But then every now and then, I think there's 2 instances of an elephant trumpeting. And it's not just trumpeting, it's a very weird primal scream where, yeah, it feels, it's hair-raising for me, If you listen to it on good speakers and at the right volume, you can kind of get a feeling of what it's like to be in this place, in this part of the world.
Okay, here's thunderstorm approaching a bai. All right, tell us about Evening in Secondary Rainforest.
So this was recorded by a very small village that we spent the night in. We just, as I said, we drove for a bit and then walked for a bit, and we were no more than 5 miles away from that village. And of course it rained, because it always rains. There's a bit of a distant thunder in there, but there's also a lot of bird species. There's a Guinea turaco, and there's another species of turaco as well, if I remember correctly. And you can hear them call, but you can also hear them fly around. And these birds, very similar to hornbills, their wing feathers are very harsh. They are not trying to be stealthy at all, because you can hear them gliding around like little airplanes. But that sound was so elusive for me. I would hear it here and there, but there was a wall of sound always, the very loud insects and other stuff happening, and rain and everything else. So I was trying to record this for many days before I managed to get this beautiful recording. And it's still not perfect. And this is not a recording of a bird flying. This is a recording of the rainforest itself. But you can get an idea what it sounds like to have one of these birds fly over. And it's majestic. It's just fascinating to listen to.
And next up we have Hot Afternoon in Primary Rainforest.
So this is a very interesting conversation, because I talked to many people about this. We went to a bunch of different places. We spent a month in Gabon, and we visited primary rainforest, secondary rainforest. We visited very young rainforest that had just kind of sprouted after it had been locked down completely. And to my surprise, many parts of the very thick primary rainforest did not sound like they were very diverse. We would get one species here, one there, even when you'd expect there to be a lot of action, a lot of activity at dawn chorus. It was very diffuse. It was very sparse. And then we'd go into this, there was a bit of it wasn't even a forest per se. It was kind of a plantation that we had these banana trees and maybe some fruit trees and some other stuff. And there were some palm trees and some other trees that had just grown. And you'd get an explosion of sound and many different species, which was very weird. I was wondering, what makes this different? What causes this difference in the number of species you can find? Maybe it was the time of year. I'm not sure exactly. I need to go back at a different time of the year and explore more. But yeah, this is an example of a kind of a sparse primary rainforest soundscape. It's, obviously it's good to have primary rainforests. And you get some species here, it sounds like something's happening, but isn't by no means as biodiverse or as full of action as other recordings that I have.
Okay, and now we've got Lush Dawn Chorus in Young Rainforest.
One of the reasons I think these rainforests that have just sprouted. They're the very young ones that had been locked down and then they kind of sprung out again. They are so lush. They're so lush because it's a boundary between a place where humans live. They live in very close. They live very closely with nature, so you can't say that they're destroying it or taking it over. And then there's also the secondary rainforest that is, as soon as you get away from the village, you get into secondary rainforest. And this is a place of boundary where species that kind of, they need to live around humans because they feed on refuse and things like that. They gather there. You get species from the secondary rainforest because that's kind of the edge of their habitat. And you get other species that just happen to be there, because it's a clearing in the rainforest. So you get this beautiful mixture of things that you would not get in a very deep and thick rainforest.
And finally, we've got here another dawn chorus. This is dawn chorus in primary rainforest.
As I mentioned earlier about the hot afternoon in primary rainforest recording, this again is quite sparse, very thick insect chorus, but the bird life doesn't seem that like it's too diverse there. You get African gray parrots and you get other species like turacos, but they seem to be spread around this rainforest. They're quite sparse as well. I'm not sure what explains that. Again, I need to do a bit more research. It might be just how the Congo Basin rainforest is. I can compare it with Borneo, where in Borneo I had loads of species in a very small space. Arguably, the Borneo rainforest is the oldest, or maybe the Sunda rainforest is the oldest rainforest we have on Earth. So maybe that's what explains it, The Congo is younger than the Amazon as well, as far as I know. So who knows? It's different. It's interesting. Obviously it's a pristine rainforest. And for me, that's enough. And it's a good representation of what the soundscape is like there.
Well, thanks for sharing all these recordings with us, George. It was really fascinating stuff to listen to. What do you hope our listeners and anyone who comes across your soundscape recordings, say on your YouTube page, for instance, takes away from them in the end? What do you hope these recordings convey to people?
What I hope is that people can feel closer to nature and wildlife this way. It's very easy to overlook sounds. We're primarily visual culture. We look at things, we scroll through things, we rarely take time to stop and listen. And unfortunately, pristine, clean soundscapes are becoming somewhat of a rarity, especially in the Western world, but also in other places. As we have roads everywhere and we have flight paths, and as we get industry and development, the first thing that has to suffer is the soundscape. And people aren't really aware, but there have been studies that have shown living in a place where you constantly hear traffic and other kind of noise, it raises your blood pressure. It causes a lot of health issues that we're not aware because we're not prioritizing or even thinking about them. Obviously, you think about air pollution and you think about, traffic accidents and things like that because that's more immediate. That's easier to see. But then when you think about noise pollution, that's not on everyone's mind. That's kind of a thing that's easy to forget and to overlook. But when you're in, in my shoes, trying to get a good soundscape that is just birdsong, for example, right? I've been asked for that for recordings of dawn choruses from the UK, and it's so difficult to get. It's much easier for me to get on a plane, go to the Congo, record something really pristine, and come back, than to find a good soundscape free from man-made noise in the UK. So I hope people can think about that as well. Maybe they can think about what it is like for them. Can they go out and listen to nature, or are they going to hear a lot of traffic? Can they sleep at night without hearing a distant truck or a distant bus or anything like that? All this kind of stuff is overlooked, and it's time we maybe changed a bit our perception of it.
If you enjoy the Manga Bay Newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/mangabay. We are a non-profit news outlet, so just $1 or more per month would really help us with offsetting production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Front Line, please head to patreon.com/mangabay to learn more and support the Manga Bay Newscast. That's patreon.com/mangabay. You and your friends can join the listeners who've downloaded the Manga Bay Newscast nearly 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Manga Bay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Front Line at mangabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/mangabay or on Twitter and Instagram, where our handle is @mangabay on both platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Manga Bay Newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.